G'day and welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to go through an update on where we're at with our little 22 Magnum ELR concept or project. For a recap for people, basically we've done a little bit of encouraging and a little bit of showing 22 long rifle PRS and ELR, so stretching things out a little bit further. And basically the main stuff we like playing with is shooting too long a range, so extreme long range, and then doing something that works for little rifles. So people can do it anywhere. You don't need a lot of acreage or anything to do that sort of stuff. With the 22 rimfire, we've only got X amount of power using factory loaded ammunition, and there is some people who are looking at doing that and making that a little better, or a little better bullets in that situation, and trying to make them more accurate. Mind you, they are surprisingly accurate. But I had this concept of simply looking at a 22 Magnum, which is sort of just a stepped up 22, so it's still a rimfire, and go through and make that work better. There's some more power to work, but how to make it work better. Now, out of my knowledge, which was limited with the 22 Magnum, the 22 Magnums have never been very accurate. You talk to anyone about it, it's about the ammunition you can buy for them, good for hunting, nice and fast for hunting, but not super accurate guns. And there's a few 22 Magnum, proud 22 Magnum owners that'll tell you different. But through all the gunsmiths and all the people who've done it to any real level, it comes down to maybe a little bit to do with different guns and different bits and pieces, but the ammunition wasn't super. The bullets you can normally get through them were really made more about hunting at 50 yards or 100 yards, so they had good terminal ballistics, but not really made to fly very well or that side of things. So I came up with the simple concept of, when I try that, get something I can work with that can run, that has a little bit more twist in the barrel, so I want to run a heavier bullet, a 40 grain or 50 grain bullet, and put in a proper 22 caliber bullet in there. For those that don't know this, the 22 Magnum is a slightly different size bore than it's actually a 224 versus the 223, which is what the bore of a 22 rimfire is. So slightly different bore. So it meant that with the 22 Magnum you can do this. So I started down that road. I put together some 50 grain projectiles, some 53 grain burgers. I basically got some, I'll quickly go through the process. I pulled some bullets apart and I pulled the bullets out of some loaded factory ammunition. Got some 50 grain, what was that? That was the Federal 50 grain ammunition. I pulled those apart. I pulled 20 of them apart. I measured all the weight of the powder. I evened it up, presuming that the powder load wasn't very even. Evened it up to make exactly, reloaded it, put some heavier bullets back into it, turns it into a single feed rifle. So it was only going to be single feed, but some nice bullets in there, and tested them. At 53 grains, that wasn't successful at all. I should recap quickly there. I chose this, which is probably not the pick of the bunch in the way of accurate rifles, but this is the 22 Magnum in the Ruger Precision Rimfire, because it had a 1 in 14 twist barrel. Most have 1 in 16, this had 1 in 14, so hoping to run a little more bullet weight and make that happen. The 53 grains didn't fly in here. It was too slow, they weren't stable. 40 grain bullets in the burger projectiles did fly. They did work, they were stable, and they started to show little signs of promise, but I still had a lot of inaccuracy issues, a lot of what looked like height or speed inaccuracy. But they were just pushed back together and set up with, tried to even up the powder and tried that process. So we had a starting point, and that's where we started from. Then I started a few testing processes, and that's where I left everyone, but I started a few testing processes. One was to go back to factory ammunition and do a bit of testing with the barrel, with different things hanging off the barrel, to see what differences I saw in harmonics or in flow or in weight or all those sorts of things. And that moves into, you see here, barrel tuning, which I haven't tested yet, but basically the harmonics and trying to dampen the harmonics and see if that made any differences. So I did some testing down that road with some normal ammunition and with some loaded ammunition. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the next bit I went to was actually in looking at the different speeds, measuring and realizing I had different speeds in the projectiles, working out what I had to do to get my load correct, and how to do that. Now it came down to a few bits and pieces. I'll grab them now, so I'll put them on the table so you can see what I did. So now these are the basic tools I used to do it. I made up myself an extended shell holder to be able to raise the bullet up so I could use pliers to extract the bullet. Bit tricky and a bit hard work to do otherwise, but it's nice and simple. So I pulled the bullets out, it's nice and simple on that form. I then went through and found that actually trying to measure the powder precisely wasn't too complicated. Trying to actually put it in the little cases with the gear I had and how sticky the very fine powder is, I found that quite complex. And I chose, listen, not saying there's not some more gains I can get there, but I had a feeling there was something else going on. So what I decided to do as my next step was I tried some different loaded ammunition, just leaving the powder in there. First of all, just seeing it and seeing if it looked even in the thing. It looked very even. But then just tried it to see what it is with the powder that was in there. So I just pull the bullet out and leave the powder alone, not touching anything else, just leave it alone. Presuming that in most cases, the actual distribution of the powder is something you could fine tune and do in a factory setup. So it's a presumption, but that maybe they do an okay job on that and there's something else going on. So that's what I did. And I should say where I ended up with was using some, I haven't got the box here, I've run out of it, but that's the 30 grain Hornady VMAX ammunition is what I ended up using, which are these little bullets here. So the last time I did this, I got 50 of those out to get all my speed readings. I got 50, pulled the bullets out like that. The next thing I do, I think it's the 22B, it's the X32 shell case, which holds the bullet nicely. And then I had to custom make myself, I think this was a 22B, I've forgotten exactly what I used here. But I basically, no, actually this is a 22 Hornet one that I modified, made a little sleeve and bits and pieces to make as a bullet seater. So those two processes meant I put the bullet back in and I did some shooting like that. Found it was okay, but really the key came into making myself a little crimp tool. Now, this is a little crimp tool, I think it's the same thing. It was the 22 Hornet crimp tool. Modified it, did some machining bits and pieces, messed around to where I got it to work, made a little seating die point, which actually pushes the bullet to exactly the right place to set it all up. All very much a case of, I think you could do all this stuff better, but very much purposely machining bits and pieces and making it all work to where I could crimp the bullet. I put together some pictures of what it looks like now, the process of the bullet as it was, the round as it was, the bullet removed, the new bullet put in, which I started using 40 grain Hornady ammunition, and now I've got the 40 grain Hornady projectiles in their, I think that's the VMAX projectile as well. But I actually went with the Muzzle is what I went with, basically because they had a tiny better ballistic coefficient, but also I didn't have any more of the Hornady stuff, and I did have some of this I bought in at the beginning of this process. And I should say, if I could find something with that or better ballistic coefficient, then I would do. And I prefer to have all aluminium, all metal rather than having the ballistic tip. But it's got a boat tail on it, so it should work really well on that score. So it should do the job really nicely. But put them in and then set up the crimp to go with that. Now, some interesting points I'll point out. There's a couple of very interesting things. Apart from it's actually starting to shoot pretty well. We did some groups. We're at the sort of 3/4 inch group at 100 yards, down to a 1/2 inch group at 100 yards. Here's the last shots here that we actually did. And that was just on 1/2 inch at 100 yards with that ammunition, which isn't great, but it's okay. It's starting to get there. The bit that I would say that is most interesting, and this would be the things which I run this past people, then they ask me these questions. One was, were the cases full with powder? You know, people talk about pulling 22 or rimfire ammunition apart and finding not much powder in there. No, that wasn't the case at all. All of the different ammunition are pulled apart. They've always had powder pretty much full, not compressed, but pretty much full to the bottom of the projectile. So when I put the 40 grain bullet in it, it's pretty much the same thing. We're not quite compressing, but we're almost compressing as it's up there. And with a good, decent crimp on it, which is all very much a case of messing around and getting to the point where I felt that looked all right, and that's what really I'm working with. That worked. It didn't overpressure, it worked really well. Ended up with really good speed. We got an average speed of around 21:30. Now here's the really interesting feature. Is That's the same average speed for the 30 grain. So the speed didn't change even though we went up 10 grains in the projectile. The more interesting feature is I actually was doing the chronographing on the 40 grain stuff that I'd loaded. And I went through 40 rounds just shooting that and just testing with the chronograph. I found the lab radar actually works really consistently. It's the best that's ever worked. It works with these little fellas. It was really, really consistent. And we ran bullet after bullet after bullet after bullet. I stopped a few times and I had it on another list and that sort of stuff. So I'm not going to go into proper ESs and that sort of stuff. I haven't gone through and tabulated that, and it'll be a bit messy over the 70 rounds that are on that. But what I actually saw was the lowest I can find in there was 2,070 feet per second. The highest was 2,150 feet per second. So that's not terrible. We're in the world of where we've only got sort of, well, that's 80, but it's not terrible in what it was doing there for this sort of projectile. And listen, terrible for centerfire, I get it, but I'd have to say the majority of them were within 10. It's really from 2130 to 2140 is where they were really running. That's the consistent ones. The odd low one, the odd high one, as far as I said, like I said, and more of the low ones were in the just under 2100, and more of the high ones were just in the top end of the 2140s. But pretty consistent actually, especially for rimfire. But the really tricky bit was when I I ran 20 rounds of the 30 grains, is that its lowest was 2012 and its highest was 2170. And there was nothing that was really the same as itself. They were moving all the time. So they had the 2070, so they had over 150 extreme spread, and their randomness was all over the place. They were really very random. So why is that? Doesn't make much sense. The bullet, it's still a decent little bullet, the 30 grain in the Hornady. What I would pick it is, and what people alluded to me in various forms previously, I sort of had an inkling of it to start off with, is that the crimp is the most important part here. And what we're actually talking about there, this is my summation and other people's summation, is that the rifling is actually very low drag on these bullets, and rather than using the rifling with the bang of the case to create the pressure, it uses the crimp to create the pressure. So more of your speed is attached to your crimp than it is to the rifling or the lance. It's a bit of a presumption at this moment, but from what I just saw the same average speed with a lot better extreme spread out of putting 40 grains in a 30 grain thing. Now I should say, and say at this point, what I'm doing in messing with ammunition is something to do very carefully and only do with very baby steps. What worked for me might not work for you. But certainly it's not just a case of swapping bullets over and see what happens. All this stuff is going to take a little bit of skill to create. It's not a simple process. And to get the sort of consistency you've got to step into it. I'm not going to go further in going to the finer details here, because this changing ammunition in any form, messing with ammunition, means you should be experienced to some level or another, and even with moderate experience, step into it very carefully. They are little tiny bullets, but there's still a lot of power involved in the little explosion in there, so tread very carefully. I went through the process that worked for me. I slowly, this was my last step where I decided to put a heavier bullet into the same amount of powder, and it worked wonderfully. I did see earlier on where I tried that with 50 grain and put a 50 grain in it, and I got a bit more pressure than I expected. So this is not going to work all the way. In this situation, it did work in this rifle. So step into it carefully. So anyway, at the moment, this round is the one we're using with a little crimp on there. It's a 40 grain Muzzle projectile in what was 30 grain projectile Hornady ammunition. Is working really well, working really nicely and very consistent and a good speed. So I think we've done that pretty well. Now that's just one side of the equation. I did quite a bit of testing with, and I've got more testing to do, and we'll get step by step, but I think we got to the place where we can sort ourselves when the paddock stray a little bit, and we can do a little bit of stretching out and see how consistent is at range. I'm not a 100-yard group shooter. don't like that, find it tedious and boring. I'd like to go out and stretch it and see how it is. We may need to do more of it, but the bullet, I think we've got to a semi-sorted profile. This bit here and screwing different pieces on the muzzle was very interesting. We'll move this across so it's a bit more in the spectrum of things. What you actually saw me shooting it with this piece here. I'll talk about this one in a minute. I'll just go through the rest of what we got here. The little muzzle brake, we screwed on the end of it just to see if it changed anything. Yes, it made an improvement from, and I suppose I'd go step by step. Shooting with the little muzzle with the thread protector on made it was okay, but the actual worst groups that this thing shot was like that. When it just had the muzzle exposed, it was terrible. Why it was terrible seemed to be a tiny bit different, but with the thread protector on, I don't really think it was. I didn't do a lot of shooting with it. It was turned into a ridiculous group when we were shooting with decent ammunition, and with other ammunition, it didn't shoot very well at all. Why that was, I'm suspecting there's some harmonics going on here, and harmonics and barrel tuning, all that sort of stuff is a conversation I'll get into later on. I want to do a comprehensive video on that, but probably attached to that scenario for various reasons, with the length of the barrel and the stiffness of the barrel and all the rest of it. But anyway, that and that shot very similar. The little muzzle brake on, it shot better. It shot actually quite a bit better. Now the muzzle brake isn't doing anything you can effectively feel, so I felt it was more to do with the weight or the harmonics or the length or something like that. And I'll get into that in a little while, like I said, but it made a little bit of difference. I also built up another little dampener that was really about the same as the muzzle brake, didn't change anything. The best way this thing shot so far is with this little contraption on it. This contraption is sort of a fairly simple idea. It's like a torque tube. There's actually a little bit of rubber or a little bit of plastic. It's actually a little bit of insulation tape down the back right on the receiver. This has inside it a fairly heavy weight. It's actually a different little muzzle brake. It's been machined down and then had a bit of thin wall chrome moly tube welded over the top of it. This goes on here, slides down in there, does up there. Now the logic to what's going on here, this is a style of a mechanic doing barrel dampening. If there's vibration, then we'll structurally help it with something or other, in both in having harmonics that fight harmonics, but also in stiffening and supporting. The logic is that this screws on tight on the front here, as you can see. The chrome moly tube then attaches the muzzle back to the beginning of the receiver with a dampening device in there. It's just a bit of insulation tape, but in theory that's going to support things and hold things stiffer and straight and all the rest of it. Now it's just theory. There's other concepts that are down the same sort of thing, whether you're talking about the structured barrel, you're talking about, I can't think of the different names of where they put a composite around then the tube on the outside. I'd sort of refer to it as a torque tube, I suppose. It's stiffening tube, whatever it is, but this actually worked in this situation. Now, is it to do with the stiffening? I don't know. It could be to do with the length. It could be to do with all sorts of things, but this is how it worked best at this moment. And that's how we did our final testing with, and that's the best group we've seen so far. Now, I'll just touch on what the last little bit in this conversation, which I haven't done any testing with, and like I said, I want to do some more with it. As to whether I'm going to put enough effort in to work it all out, I can't tell you, but that's going to this little device here. This is the barrel tuner. This is a Huntsman tuner. This system here simply goes on the front of the rifle like that. You put it on and you lock this up. There's a little clamp here. You lock it up, and then once you've done that, you can then adjust with fine thread like that, where you move this in and out, or you can also adjust it with different lengths. Yeah, let's pull that out there. So that's a different one on there. Basically, you can set this up for different lengths, front to back, so you can actually set up to the sizes you want it to be. Now, the concept we're actually talking about here is it's barrel tuning. Now, like I said, I'll try and get more into it later on, but this comes from rimfire, in a place where this has all been very much proven as something that works in a fashion that people have, I suppose, result-driven conclusions as to why it works. The concept here is that there's a vibration moving up and down, and that vibration gets to X points where it's at its stillest, where that vibration is basically in waves. And so if you get it to at particular lengths is points where it's most likely to give you the best groups, and then you can fine tune it with testing, shooting groups and testing, and finding yourself where you've got an area that looks like you got your smallest groups, not just one but a group of them, and you fine tune it to do that. All bench rest rimfire precision rifles, or pretty much all, will use a barrel tuner of some form or other, and then there's a different style of tuning when it comes into centerfire stuff, but that's something I suppose we'll test with. I have all sorts of concepts about that, and I'll go that in a different video, go through about barrel tuning. But at the moment, I'll put that back on. I'll take it off. I'll put back on what I actually use. At the moment, this little torque tube system, for want of a better word, it's something I've simply made, and it seems to be working the best of everything at this moment. So we got some more testing to do. You know, we've got a little rail in the front here when you use the Night Force Prism to set up here and shoot it out even further still. But I suppose the interesting features for today's chat, the interlude I wanted to go into, was actually the bullets we've made, the same speed as the 30 grain and the far better extreme spread was a real surprise to me. I wasn't ready for that at all. What we ended up with was not as good as I'd like, but it's pretty good. You know, we've moved into where the majority, 8 out of 10, are running in a 2130 to 2140. So that's pretty good. You know, I mean, that should perform well with a bullet with a bow tail, so it's got a 0.21 ballistic coefficient. So that should perform pretty well. I really think I've probably done enough, and you could probably do more, but I'm really impressed with it. And that's really good. That's working nicely. The real surprise was what the factory ammo was like. Now, we could do more testing, but the more you talk about it, the more you talk to people, that's the more what people see. And I think it's not got nothing to do with, well, very little to do with the amount of powder. The speed, obviously, is the bullet affects that very little. That's more how the bullet flies and how much it wobbles or does whatever it in the air. So that's not really relevant. I think it's very much about the crimp, which could turn into the brass as well and that sort of stuff. But there we have the same brass. It's just had a bullet pulled out and a bullet pulled in and the crimp done. It's a different bullet, but the crimp done very, very, where I worked out where I was happy with what I got crimp wise. And I'll put an image on what this looks like. As to whether that's perfect or not, I don't know. But that was really surprising. But it's heading quite well. We've got to now get ourselves some conditions where we can shoot out at 500 yards and 600 yards. And this season is very, very full of weeds and growing and grass and wet ground. So trying to shoot little bullets out that far is just, it frustrates the spotter a fair bit when you can't see any result out there. So we've got to get that organised so that my spotter can see and help me. And then we'll see what sort of groups we get at 600 and beyond. Anyway, that's my little update for the 22 Magnum. I would finish the video saying, if you're looking at messing with 22 Magnum or any rimfire or any ammunition, make sure you are experienced at enough to be able to do that side of things. It's not just to do and see what happens. There's a nasty little explosion happening inside there. You do the wrong thing in the wrong rifle, that's damaging. So do not step into that without being certain that you have it covered to one degree or another, whether that's a reloader with you or some experience to go through and do that sort of stuff on some form or other is what I'd recommend. And as said, I'm not going to get any closer in the details because that's really encouraging people without the knowledge to be able to get there themselves, and that's not what I'm trying to do. Anyway, guys, that's about what I can tell you. I hope that's entertaining at least, maybe some information for some people. Let us know what you think. Thanks for checking in on us, and we'll catch you next time.